I've given you speeches from 3 different historical periods, as you saw, and our emphasis in the discussion is really to look at these primary documents, that is, documents written by people in the historical period that we're studying, and to give a little to use history to give some background on the speeches, but also use the speeches to help us understand the history. And in addition, we're going to look at some of the religious literary references that are in all of these speeches in detail, and we're conducting this as an interdisciplinary seminar that way, by including history, public speech and debate, and literature and religion, because that is really one of the most powerful ways, I think, of studying, and one that's being used much more commonly in the university system. In addition to that, though, we would like to draw connections between American history and Taiwanese history, and that's what Dr. Cho's really going to help us do. We're talking about 2 countries that were settled by people from somewhere else. There are similarities and big differences as well, and so we are going to have a few group exercises, a few really short writing exercises, and then finally at the end open up to some larger questions for us to consider. And while we'll talk about history, I prefer if people didn't get bogged down in facts or details, and that we really focus instead on some of the ideas here rather than worrying about the facts. So when I give you some of the historical background, let's not worry too much about detail. Let's just say you're at a party. Next year, if you go to the United States, it's going to be a presidential election again. And, just to be familiar with some of the ideas that I don't think you learn from a history book, and that are very much present in the way we think about our politics. So to have something to talk about, to feel comfortable talking about some of these ideas, it's a great way to integrate into the society where you're going, and be able to talk about the ideas that are going to be at play. Because I guarantee you, when you hear the speeches this year and also next year, you are going to hear many of the same recurrent topics. These are very much buzzwords. That's one of the interesting things about the United States, is that it's a country that's been founded upon a series of ideas. It's an experiment which is still going on, and that's based on many of the ideas that we're going to talk about today. I think one of the things that's very difficult for many people from developed countries to understand, from a place like Taiwan or from European countries or Australia, is what a deeply religious country the United States is. Because most developed countries today are very secular. And the United States is, of all the developed countries, by far the most religious country. You're talking about, in this day and age, still it's about 67% of the people attend church regularly, as opposed to one of the highest in Europe, which is in the 20%, so Spain. So it's a huge difference. Let's look at just a little background on John Winthrop and what was happening before the Arabella ship went to New England, to Massachusetts. What was happening in Europe? Does anybody know in the 1500s and the early 1600s what was happening in Europe politically or religiously? Like any information at all? A lot of young people just don't know that earlier time period. So we're talking about, for 1,520 years, it was one church called the Roman Catholic Church, with a man who was the head of it called the Pope. So if you've been to Rome, that's where the Vatican is, that's where the Pope is. And you can think of the Pope as an emperor, a religious emperor, because all of the kings of Europe had to obey him. So we have this system of, throughout history, many kings that were trying to get power over the Pope, but they couldn't, because the Pope could easily tell the king that he was not part of the community anymore, which is called excommunication, to dismiss him, to let him go, and he would lose his power over the people. So that's what was going on for 1,500 years. And it was in the early 1500s that a monk, like a Buddhist monk, but a Christian monk, called Martin Luther, you probably heard of him in Germany, made some challenges to the Catholic Church. And I won't go into the details, but he challenged some of the practices that were going on in the Catholic Church. And think about it this way. So if you have the Pope who's like an emperor, what do you think the kings would want in terms of power? Would they want to continue to take orders from the Pope, or perhaps give the orders themselves? Exactly. So a lot of kings and princes in Europe, particularly Northern Europe, loved what Luther was saying. Not necessarily for religious reasons, but because it would make them independent of the Pope. And so one of these was a man named Henry VIII, who has had more written about him than probably any other English king. He was very famous for having many, many wives, not at the same time, one after the other, and having them assassinated when he got sick of them. When he got sick of one, and then he had another and another. So Henry VIII, but initially Henry VIII was married to a Spanish princess named Catherine of Aragon. They had children, but not a male heir, which was a problem because if you're a king, as we know, you have to have a male heir. At least at the time. It changed right after, but you had to have a male heir. And he was very, very worried about that, and he thought that God was punishing him. And so he had to figure out a way to get rid of his wife. But he couldn't, because you're not allowed to get divorced under Christian law. You can't get divorced for any reason unless you can prove that your wife has been adulterous, has been with somebody else. And in some cases, if you couldn't have children, but of course he could have children. He had some girls. So what does he do? He decides that he's going to take some of Luther's, he's going to embrace what Luther is saying and part with the Pope and say, forget it, I'm not going to be subject to the Pope. And I'm going to be the head of my own church. So he becomes the head of the church in England, which is a big, big, big deal, right? Because for 1,500 years, the Pope had been the head of it. Well, what happens after this is for about 100 years, we have different kings, and we have Queen Mary, but she's only queen for about 5 years, and then Queen Elizabeth, who are the children of Henry VIII, and these are really great stories. There's a lot of fantastic series about these kings and queens because they have very interesting stories behind them. But Queen Mary is a Catholic, so she obeys the Pope. When she becomes queen, after her father dies, after Henry VIII dies, she decides she's going to avenge herself. She's going to take revenge, to punish everybody who she feels is wrong religiously. So think about Queen Mary. Imagine yourself in this position. Mary is a princess whose mother was sent to a tower to live alone the rest of her life so that her father could marry all these women. How would you feel? What feelings would you have when you knew your mother had been put into a tower to spend her life and die there alone, and you have had to leave the country, and you come back and now you're queen? How do you think you would act to the people that you thought were responsible for having your mother put away? Angry, right? Angry. It's a normal human emotion. So she goes back. Queen Mary is a Catholic, and she has all of the people, what are called Protestants, the people that follow Luther, they're Protestants. She makes sure that many of them are burned alive. So she gets, have you ever heard of the drink of Bloody Mary? It's named after Queen Mary because she had so many people killed. She was only queen for 5 years. Then Queen Elizabeth becomes queen. Queen Elizabeth is the daughter of Henry VIII and another woman. She becomes the longest ruling queen up until this point, because there's never been a queen who ruled for a long time. So this is a completely new thing. And she's got two religious parties. She's got the people who follow the Pope, the Catholics and the Protestants, and they hate each other. And so there's a lot of outbreaks of violence, and she does not want to repeat what her sister did. She doesn't want to have this, trying to kill all the people that she thinks are wrong. And so she tries to create a government that allows Catholics and Protestants more or less to live together. When she dies, though, things change a bit. We have King James, the next king, which is Charles I, decides that he is going to persecute or punish the Protestants again. And so basically, when we get to this scenario, the Puritans, the people who go to America, are these Protestants. And they're not being allowed to practice their religion the way they want to. That's basically what it comes down to. They're called Puritans because they saw themselves as pure, that is, that they were practicing Christianity in its original form. And we'll see what those original ideas are. But they saw themselves as practicing a pure form of Christianity. And do you know when America was discovered? What year? By who? So this is his name in English. He was actually Italian, but he worked for the Spanish. He went in 1492. And what we're talking about when the Puritans go is this ship that we're going to talk about, John Winthrop, is 1630. So that's a long time in between that the Spanish had been exploring the New World. And you've heard of Mexico, right? Heard of the country of Mexico and Peru and all of South America and Central America were already belonged to the Spaniards, with the exception of Brazil. So the Spaniards had really gone there and conquered most of it. So when the English got in the game in 1630, this had been going on for 140 years that people had been exploring the Americas. And the Spaniards were really interested in bringing back gold and silver. And they set up their colonies really they wanted to bring religion to the Native Americans, but they were also motivated by financial to make money. When John Winthrop, the first speech, when he goes, does anybody know, why do you think that people like John Winthrop, these Puritans, may have wanted to go to the United States? I've given you the historical background. If you were a Puritan, why do you think you might want to leave England? These Puritans were primarily motivated by freedom of religion. They were afraid to practice their religion, and they were very religious. Very, very religious. So that's the key thing. These were people that had money in England, some of them. Most of them, they were not poor people that were leaving to make a better life financially, like later immigrants to the United States would be. They were going for religious reasons. But the company that was paying for the trip, the Massachusetts Bay Company, just like many of the Dutch companies, wanted to make money. So they had people that were going to go settle, to create colonies, to trade with the Native Americans. They thought there was gold in North America since the Spaniards had found gold and silver. Turns out there's no gold in that part of North America. What they could trade was mainly for fur pelts that they could bring back and different kind of agricultural goods. But it was not the rich place that South America was. So they went for religious reasons. And what do you think the Pilgrims expected when they arrived in North America? They didn't realize how bad the weather was going to be. So that they weren't expecting. Because the Spaniards had gone to Central America and South America, which have nice climate. North America is very bad climate compared to Europe. It's much colder and much hotter. And that's why when the first colony went 10 years before John Winthrop, the first Massachusetts one, there was a lot of people that died. They couldn't stand the cold winters. And I don't know, a lot of people think England has a bad winter. And I honestly, I've lived 2 years in England. I can tell you that I thought the winters were extremely mild. It rains a bit, but it's pretty warm compared to New York, and certainly compared to Massachusetts. It's mainly because Northwest Europe has this maritime climate. Even though they're further north than, England is much further north than New York is in terms of latitude, they benefit from the patterns of the ocean bringing in the warmer air, and that's what keeps Western Europe very mild given how far north it is. Because you think about it this way, New York and Madrid are about the same latitude, Madrid, Spain, and Madrid is a hot, hot place. It has to do with that maritime climate. And then, so the other question would be, like, that these Puritans are going to America, and they're obviously not bringing the king with them. That's the main reason why they're leaving. But they're also not bringing the police or all the government officials with them. So they're basically a bunch of people that are going to set up a town, a colony, without all of the officials that you're used to living with. And the thing is, I mean, England in the 15 and 1600s was a place where there was a lot of terror. People lived in a lot of fear, especially when it came to religion and practicing their religion. So it was, in a sense, they're going to a place that's altogether without any of these things. But think about how dangerous that can be. If you've ever seen any of those shows where people go to a deserted island, you get a group of people in a deserted island and things get hard. What do people sometimes do in those situations? And of course, we know that does happen. People do eat each other in extreme situations, like when that plane crashed in the Andes Mountains, and that does happen. But let's say it doesn't get that bad, where we're eating each other. Let's say it's a little better. What are some of the other possibilities? There's a group of us. We have no king anymore. We have nobody telling us what to do. What could possibly happen? Fighting. Right. What else? Anybody else?
Pray.
Well, that's one possibility, right? Is that instead of fighting, we pray with each other. Anybody else?
Divide the jobs, divide the jobs and cooperate.
Right. Cooperate.
Mm-hmm.
And what would be the opposite of cooperating?
They can fight among themselves, or they cooperate.
Right.
To survive.
Right. Exactly. And we have a lot of options in terms of how we can set up this government. We could decide to have a new king, or somebody who would function like a king, like a governor who has, even though there's only 20,000 people of us that are going to this colony, it's 20,000 men and women and children. We would still have somebody that is a tyrant, and that's somebody who demands that everybody follow what they say. They don't care what anybody else thinks, and sometimes it's just for their own benefit. And if I decided to be a tyrant, I could use all of you and have you live very poorly, but give me most of what you make. So if we're farming, I get most of your goods and you can live in poverty. So, but the other option would be that we create a government where we participate together, we make decisions together, or at least men do, right? Free men, as they were called, free men. We have that option. Of course, they had the option to include women, but they didn't. So, but men who could rule together. They elected governors and who would help rule, but everybody had a say. So this early Puritan government was, some people have even called it socialist or Marxist, because everybody shared in what was made. So that is how they decide to set it up. So we're going to have just, before we go into the speech, we're going to have a little bit of a role play. I'm going to give everybody a role. So, farmer. And so think you're a farmer and think about the things that matter to you as a farmer. Carpenter, a priest, a doctor,
Okay.
and a teacher, and then a housewife.